What's up, gamers? Let's talk about Warborne Above Ashes. So this is my second Warborne video. I put one out after the first 7-day playtest with my initial thoughts, and I'm putting this one out after the Total War 30-day playtest. So if you're new to the game or you haven't seen that video yet, I'd recommend watching it before this one, as I won't be repeating the basic systems of the game, as I'd like to dive a little bit deeper. I do think it's necessary for me to again give a full disclosure that I was sponsored to stream Warborne during this playtest, and I've already been approved for another run in the next playtest, but this video is not sponsored, and it's really just my honest opinions. Now, if you don't want to sit through this whole video and you just want to know my thoughts, I really like Warborne. I genuinely believe it is a game that can do great things, and I couldn't be more excited to continue playing it. I was able to explore a lot deeper into the game in this playtest than the last, and I'm totally hooked. This playtest was a month-long playtest, and the first one to introduce the 6-faction system that Warborne has. Effectively, when you start the game, you get to choose one of 6 factions, and then as the playtest or season goes on, each of these factions fights over zones in the map, culminating in fighting over the very center zone. I'm really excited to see how this game develops, and I honestly think it could turn out to be the best PvP-based MMO on the market. In order to explain a lot of my thoughts, I'm going to also have to tell you the story of this playtest for me. So Warborne organized a pre-assembly event as a way to drum up hype for the game, as well as to allow guilds, warbands. Listen, I've been using the term guild for so long, I don't think I could change my vocabulary at this point in time. So you're going to have to accept that when I say guilds, I actually mean warbands. Now, in the first playtest, I made a small guild of friends so that we could run around and do whatever small to medium scale content we want, as well as hop into any of the big faction fights if we wanted to. I had the intention of doing the same thing on Ashvara server this time, so I chose to go into the Shroud faction, which was meant to have a guild that I have some friends in, as well as another large guild that I know some people in. I thought my group could do whatever we wanted and then show up to the big wars to help our faction, maybe do some bomb squad type stuff, nothing too crazy. Then, as the playtest started, one of the guilds decided not to participate, and the other massive guild decided to join another faction instead, which left my group of about 40 friends as suddenly the biggest guild in the faction. So, I adapted. I started welcoming new people into the guild to the point where we were constantly at capacity. This brings up one of my first major complaints about Warborne actually. Warborne has a guild capacity system, where as you level up your guild, you can have more members in the guild. This doesn't work in a seasonal based game in my opinion. The endgame capacity is around 200 for a guild, but a guild starts at about 60 player capacity on day 1. So what are you meant to do with all the other players in your guild? It leads guilds to creating multiple alt guilds just to house their players, which in turn creates resentment from players that aren't in the main guild, and also creates a lot of issues in terms of guild rewards, priority queue, etc., just because of a pointless scaling guild capacity. Back to my story. So my guild started capturing harvesters. Harvesters are essentially the mechanic that allows a faction to own a zone in the map. In order to capture a harvester, you need to destroy the core of the harvester using demolishers, and killing guardians at the harvester allows the core to take more damage. Because this wasn't content I participated in the first test, I had no idea how it worked. One of the first harvesters my guild of about 60 people tried to capture was instead captured by a guild in my faction with about 6 members. The guild that captures a harvester is based on participation. So while my guild ran around killing the guardians to make the core vulnerable, the much smaller guild instead spent their time dropping demolishers on the core right from the start. This obviously led to some infighting in the faction, and from what I was told, this was actually common among other factions and other servers as well. Losing that one initial harvester actually ended up setting us a full day behind the other factions in terms of progress on the map. Very quickly, it became apparent that we as Shroud faction were very outnumbered. Not to mention that due to the map positioning, we were right in the middle of 2 of those factions, and they both wanted to push towards us. As I mentioned, because our guild was full, other guilds in the Shroud faction started to grow as well, so I quickly tried to make connections with them and establish a working relationship. At the point where we finally had a solid partnership with the other large guild in our faction was about when both enemy factions on the east and west started pushing hard into our zones. The guild we were working with decided this wasn't the kind of content that they enjoyed, and they would rather have a chill experience on one of less populated servers. So we were suddenly back to being a solo guild faction. The way I saw it, my friends and I had no ambition of ever winning the season or owning the whole map. Our only real goal was to have fun fights. Besides that, every time we got a fight that was anywhere close in numbers, we were absolutely running over our opponent. The idea of giving up seemed stupid. The message that I told my guild every day was that we would show up and fight over every last zone. They can bring thousands and push our faction all the way back to the starter zones if they want to, but even if we don't have anything to fight over, we'll still show up to wherever the biggest war is and kill as many people as we can. It turned out though, other guilds did not have the same outlook as us, which leads me to the next couple of big issues with Warborne as I see it. To start, there's currently no limitations on faction size, meaning if the largest faction in the game has 1,000 players and the smallest faction has 100 players, when a new player jumps into the game, they're free to join the largest faction and make that population disparity even worse. If someone is paying attention to how a season is going and they're starting a couple days late, they're more likely going to join the biggest faction. Very few gamers will choose to join the smallest faction and have a harder time. I think this is self-evident. When multiple zones can be contested over at the same time, it becomes impossible for a smaller faction to reasonably compete against a much larger faction. I personally believe that faction numbers have to be regulated in order for a competitive season to play out. What this might look like is something along the lines of everyone is free to choose whatever faction they like, and once a faction hits 500 players, it cannot exceed 500 players until every other faction has 500 players. The counter argument I have heard for limiting faction sizes is that players might want to play with their friends, which I think is reasonable, but I think they could either join at the start, wait until the faction expands, join another faction without their friends, or simply wait until next season starts if they only want to play with their friends. It isn't an ideal solution and definitely needs more details refined, but I think it is a good start. The next big issue is faction swapping. Similarly to joining a faction, players are free to swap to other factions throughout the season. With no limitations placed, again, what ends up happening is players, and as we saw this playtest, whole guilds, when faced with adversity, would opt to move to one of the already large and successful factions. If you're in a particular faction and you log in one day to find that the biggest guild in your faction decided to leave, you're ultimately left with the option to either also change factions or simply stop playing the game this season. Both of these options seemed to take place this playtest, and as the season went on, a lot more of the latter occurred. I think with any seasonal-based game, you can expect the population to decrease as the season goes on. I think Warborne needs to work on a system to retain the player base longer throughout the season. I do not think players or guilds should be able to swap factions and join one of the already large factions. If a guild wants to swap to one of the smaller factions, that seems totally fine. Or some have even suggested an option for factions to completely concede, and then in fact merge with the next smallest faction. I don't have a perfect solution for this problem, but again I think regulation of faction swapping needs to be done. Now, jumping back to my playtest story, by this point a lot of guilds have either swapped factions or dropped out of the server. Politics and drama were starting to go wild in the game. One of the guilds that swapped factions immediately set their sights on taking our few remaining zones. I'm not going to spend too much time rehashing this, and I'm not going to throw out any accusations. Effectively, it locked us into a bitter fight day in and day out over 2 zones on the map. When I talked earlier about the factions on the west and east of us pushing us, we had decided to retreat in the map and maintain one particular zone as our home zone. So when the guild that swapped factions immediately started attacking us, we did everything we could to defend this zone. I mentioned earlier that a harvester has to be captured to own a zone for a faction. The way that you can take a harvester is by leveling up an adjacent one using cores that spawn in the game, and once a harvester reaches level 3, you can attempt to capture it during a war timer. The wartime system has some major flaws. In this playtest, they allowed you to vote for 2 things, the time and the length of war, either 30 minutes or 45 minutes. So if the first war timer was at 1 time, you would in theory fight for upwards of 45 minutes, have a little over an hour to recuperate and plan, and then fight for another 45 minutes. This would be fine. But due to various mechanics in the game, what ended up happening would be armies would start setting up over 30 minutes before a war timer by setting up various traps and then continuously fight for sometimes over 3 hours. This was exhausting. Even for the most hardcore gamer out there, I think this sort of pacing would cause a lot of people to burn out pretty quickly on the game. Now, my guild was able to defend our home zone through very hard fought close fights for a couple days, but then one day, we defended the harvester in the first war timer down to literally 1% HP on the core. When the timer ended, I told my guild to relax and get ready to go for the next war timer. But our enemy didn't. Instead, they spent the whole hour in between war timers camping on the harvester and setting up traps, so that my guild had no option to actually repair the core between timers or even get into a position to defend it at the start of the next timer, and as such, they easily took it. I hadn't even thought of the tactic of camping on a harvester between war timers, but as they told me, it's something they learned from the guild that forced them to quit their faction initially. So there's my next complaint. There needs to be a system to disallow this. It isn't fun gameplay for anyone. No one wants to deny content by having over 100 of your faction sitting on an enemy's harvester before Wartimer. For this problem, I actually do have an easy fix. The harvester core could emit an aura or a blast during non-Wartimers that destroys enemy traps and turrets, and it deals a stacking % health damage to players so they can't survive on an enemy harvester for more than, say, 1 minute out of Wartimer. Done. Problem fixed. Now, in all of this constant fighting, I was able to see how much the combat had improved in Warborne from the first playtest to this playtest. It was literally night and day. In the first playtest, the large-scale fighting felt very one-dimensional for the most part, with overtuned range drifters and weapons able to just repeatedly delete front lines, healers and tanks both feeling underpowered and limited options in terms of how to play. This playtest, however, really had the capabilities for some evolved combat. Setting up proper engages, defensives, cleanses, purges, bomb squads, positioning, placeable traps, battle mounts, and even turrets, the level of play you get into in large combat was actually pretty amazing. Before this playtest came out, Warborne dropped 85 pages of balance changes, which showed that they really listened to feedback from the first playtest. And even throughout this playtest, they made numerous important changes to improve balancing as well. Some weapons still end up outshining others, things like the Wingblade and the Predator Bow, but I bet you'll see balance changes made to them before the next playtest. Now, I want to give a couple updates on things I talked about in the last video so I can expand on them. First, drift marker defensives were changed so they're only active during Wartimers. They did still feel pretty oppressive, but you weren't completely locked out of a zone because of 100 stacked drift markers. I think they could still be adjusted for effectiveness during Wartimer, otherwise, perfect change. I mentioned how I didn't feel like Gathering was in a finished state, and I would still stand by that. In playing a lot of large-scale content this playtest, I actually noticed firsthand that you had to literally gather a lot to sustain yourself, because the resources are needed to craft potions, traps, etc. that you need constantly. Even with the guild being able to provide some of these things, it still seemed pretty difficult to gather enough to support yourself, and locating resource nodes still felt difficult, so I think more work needs to be done on this area. Next, I talked about these. Turns out they're harvester dungeons, and boy was I wrong in the first video. These actually turned out to be one of the most efficient ways to level up your character and gear as a group, while also providing some really fun medium scale content. I had tons of really fun fights in Harvester dungeons. The way that they're connected to other zones in the maps allows various factions to all get pushed together in them and fight it out. They can also be used to travel through the map more efficiently, though I do think the ability to transport cores, for example, through the Harvester dungeons should be disabled. I also talked about 3 things that I think could prevent the success of Warborne, namely the seasonal system, player acquisition, and finally monetization. I don't have big updates to add to the first 2. Warborne hasn't fully unveiled what will and won't transfer between seasons, but they have said that they're all but finalized their plans for this. Player acquisition is hard to comment on, but from my perspective, it did seem like a lot of people were playing this playtest, and of the people that I talked to, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. As far as monetization, this playtest, it did seem like a few systems were soft launched that will lead towards their monetization approach. There were 2 types of battle passes, one general and one faction. A currency called Solar Byte was used to purchase both of these, which you receive by selling things on the auction house. Because players couldn't earn Solar Byte, Warborne instead implemented a system that automatically bought items from the auction house if they were priced reasonably. In addition, Solar Byte could be used to improve your drifters and gear masteries in ways that scale pretty drastically. There were various ways and some exploits to obtain a lot of Solar Byte in this playtest, and as a result, a few players were much too strong. If Solar Byte is just sold directly in its current state without limitations and controls placed on it, things could spiral out of control. I do hope the Warborne devs are putting careful consideration into this. So, to wrap up story time for you guys, my guilds ended up fighting endlessly. Hard battles every single day. More and more guilds in the game folded, and some players even decided to come join us because they could tell we weren't going anywhere. The big scary guild that actually knocked out most of the other guilds or forced them to switch factions eventually made their way down the map to the zones that we were fighting over. Now, I know there is no way I can possibly word this without causing at least one still bitter person to drop a comment about handholding, but when that big scary guild got to our part of the map, they went straight for the guild to swap factions to attack us. Now, did I stop my Zerg from zoning into the zone so they could have a fair 100 versus 100 fight? Yep. If all 3 of us were in the same zone, did I focus my attack on the guild that we had been fighting every single day? You betcha. Eventually, the guild that we had been fighting every day was run out of the server, and we got a couple real fun fights with that big scary guild that wiped everyone else out. In the end, the big scary guild won the season, their ally got 2nd place, and my guild got 3rd, almost solely based on the fact that we just didn't quit. Now, we're preparing for the next playtest and future seasons as a guild. After the playtest, myself and a lot of my guild members have been playing other games together. A lot of these people are people that I didn't know before this Warborne playtest, and I could easily see myself being friends with them for a long time. Not to get too sappy, but that's pretty cool. With so many games focusing on the solo players and a lot of the socialization being removed from games, I think it's awesome that a game can encourage group play to the point that it can spark a community. I'm not going to get too deep into the topic, but I always get the question, is this game a game I can play solo? As opposed to, is this a game that I can make friends? And I really do think Warborne is a game that you can make friends playing. In my last video, I spent a lot of time comparing different aspects between Warborne and Albion Online, and I'll do a little bit of that again. Just to preface all of this, I have to say that this Warborne playtest started April 24th, and the last time I logged into Albion was April 23rd. The Warborne playtest has been over for about 2 weeks now, and I haven't had a single desire to log into Albion. A lot of my friends that played Warborne with me, especially content creator friends, have been playing Albion again in this time, so I'm not trying to suggest that Warborne will make someone never want to play Albion again, but for me personally, it just doesn't seem appealing right now. However, I think I have consumed all of the available Warborne content on YouTube at this point, and in watching my friend T-Bange's video about Warborne, he actually said something in a more concise way than I could have. Simply, Warborne is a PvP game, Albion is not. This isn't to say that PvP isn't in Albion, and you can certainly spend your time in Albion searching for PvP, but that doesn't make it a PvP game. In Albion, you can focus entirely on economy, gathering, farming, various kinds of PvE, etc. And a large percentage of the player base does just that. If you're someone that enjoys PvP in Albion, you can put yourself in various positions where you might encounter PvP, like the Black Zone, the roads, etc. But generally, the amount of time you spend searching for PvP in Albion greatly outweighs the amount of time you actually spend PvPing. It's entirely possible to spend over an hour searching for PvP in Albion content, only to be rewarded with PvP content that lasts less than a minute. And anyone that has played Albion for a long time has experienced nights where they didn't actually find PvP at all. On top of that, the instance PvP content specifically designed to cater to PvP players, things like Hellgates, Corrupted Dungeons, and Crystal League have essentially all been abandoned by Albion dev. These content types haven't been updated, rewards are outdated, and balance is never kept, and as such, the population in all of them is either dwindling or completely gone. Albion has actually been touting a Hellgate update for months, and just recently they announced this. Loot will maybe be improved, you can queue from any city, which no Hellgate player actually cares about, and they're going to remove one of the Hellgate types. Yippee. All of this to say the development of Albion for years now has not been in favor of PvP players. I don't believe that the business model for Albion includes maintaining veteran PvP players in the game. The design choices and changes seem to be made entirely by Albion devs, with little to no consideration being put towards feedback from longtime players. Warborne is the opposite. Every system in the game feels as though it was designed with the concept of PvP as the basis. You want to fight these monsters and take their chests of goodies? Cool. But as soon as you attack the monsters guarding the chest, now that chest lights up on the map, so everyone in the zone knows you're there doing it. You want to kill a big dinosaur so you can skin it and take its hide to craft a bunch of potions or other consumables? Cool, but that dinosaur appears as a glowing gold icon on the map. And if it's a really big dinosaur, they'll even have a pop-up announcement for everyone to see. You want to do a little solo dungeon to level up your character and get some loot? Cool, but you can get double the loot if you expose your dungeon to the world, making it so that an enemy can invade and attack you. Conceptually, everything in Warborne is to enable PvP. When doing any content, you're not risking getting PvP'd as though it's a negative to be scared of. It is the basis for the game. Whereas endgame, you can literally only level up through PvP. Once you get to level 45 in either character, drifter, or gear, you can no longer level up just from killing monsters. So effectively, the strongest players in the game end up being the ones who PvP successfully the most. There are things in Warborne that aren't perfect, but I actually really believe the devs care about the community and want to make it the best game they can for them. An example is early in the playtest, there were some frustrating moments when I was shot calling for my guild and inexplicably was zoned out of the fight because of the queue system. I sent a message to one of the devs, and I'm sure many others complained, and literally the next day, guild leaders were given priority, and I was never zoned out from a queue again. Even to further this, as of the day that I'm recording this video, Warborne is doing a player queue test to further improve the queue system before the next playtest. Now, one big takeaway that I personally have after playing the first playtest is that the developers actually have a vested interest in making the game something that players want to play. What that means is they actually consider feedback and they make changes depending on how the community sees the game. You can see this thought process going into one of their recent announcements where they ended it saying, "Furthermore, we are also considering more open and diverse ways to co-create Warborne with with our community. This sort of ideal coming from game developers can only lead to a fun game for the people to play it. With that in mind, before I even made this video, I passed on most of the thoughts that I had in this video to the developers directly, and I really do believe that they're taking that feedback into consideration. So that largely wraps up my thoughts on Warborne at this point in time. As you can tell, my opinions are largely positive. I think this game is awesome, and I look forward to playing it a lot more. If you're someone that's tried Warborne, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on the game. And if you want to see more Warborne content, leave a comment and let me know what you want to see. Thanks.